Here in the Philippines, when it comes to our foreign policy, we tend to focus on the big powers, major countries, China, United States, and increasingly also India. But in many ways, Japan is actually the stealth superpower in this part of the world. It remains as one of the leading economic partners of many, if not most, Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines. And more recently, Japan is also trying to present itself as a security partner to more and more countries in the region, including the Philippines. Accordingly, Prime Minister Kishida visited Manila recently, where he met President Marcos Jr. He also became the first Japanese leader in recent memory to present a speech before the Joint Congress of the Philippines as the two countries explore even tighter security cooperation, including a visiting forces agreement style deal, or what is called a reciprocal access agreement, something that Japan also has with other countries around the world like Australia and the United Kingdom. The question is, how far can Japan go in terms of providing security assistance to the Philippines without undermining its own pacifist constitution? And also, we have to wonder, to what degree can Japan play a more independent and autonomous role in stabilizing our part of the world? In order to understand these big tectonic shifts in our part of the world and how Japan is navigating it, we're going to talk to someone who knows a lot about Japan's foreign policy and its expanding relationship with the Philippines. Joining us tonight via Zoom is Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel. He's Adjunct Senior Fellow and Director of Maritime Programs at Pacific Forum. And he's also Associate Professor at the Tokyo International University. Thank you, Dr. Ordaniel, for joining us. I hope I got the basics right. Good evening.
Right. Good evening. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Pleasure, as always. Now, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, obviously, when it comes to the Philippines, we always talk about China. We always talk about the United States. More recently, of course, we also discussed Australia because Prime Minister Albanese visited the town. But for me, really, I mean, perhaps in many ways, the most comprehensive partner that the Philippines has is, you could argue that it's Japan, because it has been a very big economic player in the Philippines, way ahead of a lot of countries, if not also the United States. But now Japan is becoming a more comprehensive partner in the sense that there's also a security dimension. And literally, now we're not only talking about overseas development assistance, but also overseas security assistance. So in light of that, we had Prime Minister Kishida recently visiting Manila and also Kuala Lumpur to essentially announce a new era in Japanese foreign policy. Can you first do the background before talking about Japan, Philippines, and ASEAN? What's really going on there in Japan? Because last time I checked, their constitution is still the same pacifist constitution. But we understand that under the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, they still managed to work around that pacifist constitution to reconfigure, to put it mildly, Japan's role in the region. Can you tell us a little bit about this realism diplomacy that Prime Minister Kishida has been talking about and the shifts that happened over the past decade?
I think there is a recognition here in Japan about the need to counter the negative consequences of China's rise. And there is still a very vocal isolationist voice here in Tokyo. But I think when it comes to China-related issues, there are really no controversy. So if you noticed, they, even before the OSA came about this year, they already tried to redirect some of their ODA funding, overseas development assistance funding, for the benefit of maritime safety and security in Southeast Asia. So, for example, under President Aquino, Japan provided or pledged to provide 10 Coast Guard vessels, multi-role patrol vessels. Obviously, Japan delivered not just 10, but 12 in total. And Prime Minister Kishida in Manila recently said that Japan is willing to provide 5 more Magbano class vessels, which are really big vessels able to traverse the Philippines' vast exclusive economic zone. And so there is that appetite among the Japanese policymakers about helping Southeast Asian states withstand coercion from China. All right, so they don't have an illusion that they would fight on behalf of these countries. So what they're trying to do is to help these countries withstand coercion. And so in Japan, there is very little controversy about that. They still have that pacifist constitution, as you have said, Article 9. But really, there is no legal restrictions here in Japan when it comes to security assistance. It's more about the sensitivity towards the issue of exporting lethal weapons, right? So traditionally, they have really focused on providing development assistance. That was the sort of be all and end all of Fukuda doctrine, right? That Japan would not be a military force, but rather a force for promoting economic growth throughout the region. But obviously, things have changed since the 1970s, and now Japan is worried about China, and so it's concentrating its limited resources on things that matter, including, for instance, providing the Philippines with the capability to withstand coercion from China in maritime spaces.
Yeah, let's go back to the Article 9 shortly, but before that, I want to also ask, like, obviously, one of the drivers is not only the rise of China, but quite an aggressive dimension to the rise of China. We see that, of course, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and of course, this is very relevant to Japan because of the Senkaku issue. We'll also discuss it later on, the Taiwan dimension to this. But isn't there also an American angle to this? I mean, concerns about how reliable America can be, especially after the Trump, let's say, interlude, when there were times that you were not sure what you're going to get out of the United States, and it's very likely that we may have someone like Trump, if not Trump himself, back in the White House soon. So how has that affected Japan's calculus? Because for half a century, Japan, we can talk about Yoshida Doctrine among others. Essentially, the idea was the U.S. will be the guarantor of security in the region, and Japan will be kind of the Robin to the Batman of the United States, if I can put it crudely. But I think those assumptions have been really reassessed over the past decade, right?
Right. But I also think that in Japan, they see the Trump administration as an exception, not the norm.
Right.
I don't think that many Japanese policymakers, strategic thinkers, are considering a world where the United States is no longer the leader, where the United States is no longer that ally that they could count on when it comes to contingencies. Having said that, I think that what you said is right, that there is a need for Japan also to diversify its security partnerships, security relationships, and making sure that in the eyes of the world, Japan is not just the Robin to Batman USA,
Right.
but rather a player in itself, an actor in itself with agency, and not just doing whatever the United States wants it to do. It's just so happened, though, that over the past, say, 70 years, the national security interest, the national economic interest of Japan aligned with the United States, right? I can't think of a security issue out there where Japan and the United States are not on the same page.
Interesting. I mean, of course, you could say maybe perhaps on the Middle East crisis, perhaps Japan has taken a more nuanced stance, if you can put it that way, on the Iranian nuclear issue, on the Gaza issue, among others. But I see where you're coming from. Now, obviously, a person we have to really talk about here is the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, because I think he has been very transformative and has really set the stage for what we're seeing with Kishida, among others, who are in many ways his protege. But I want to talk about also another interlude in Japan's foreign policy, which was the DPJ, right? I think this is Prime Minister Hatoyama, right? I remember very well. I mean, I was just still an undergraduate student, and there was a lot of excitement about former professor in Stanford and also Prime Minister Hatoyama, who I think is still quite a controversial voice because he seems to be someone who's more, I won't say sympathetic, but he's someone who's willing to lend an ear to what China has to say about the future of the region, right? If I'm not mistaken, he supported China's BRI or AIB projects when he was the prime minister, very shortly, of course, but more due to domestic issues. He talked about kind of a common brotherhood, we're all Asians, and all of that kind of rhetoric, which of course is music to the ears of China. To what degree do you think the DPJ interlude kind of explains where Japan is going, in a sense that that interlude was not very effective, perhaps, right, in making Japan feel any more secure because China just kept on pushing it, including during the period of DPJ?
Right. I think the period of DPJ was really characterized by the international community is still a little confused about
Right.
what the rise of China meant for the world, including in the United States. I think during that time in the United States, the old consensus was still prevailing that we need to engage China on economic issues, that we need to make China wealthier so that they could have a a wealthier middle class, or a bigger middle class who would demand democracy, right? Obviously,
Right.
that's not happening. So there was that period. In fact, every Philippine president, right? When he for example, President Aquino, when he assumed the presidency in 2010, China was among the very first destinations for his state visit, right?
Right.
And he was hopeful that he could separate the South China Sea issue from the broader broader China-Philippine relations. And he was mistaken. And I think every
Mm.
new leader would assume that they could separate the South China Sea issue from the broader relationship. But again, China's activities in the South China Sea and in other realms like economic
Right.
coercion continue to frustrate them,
So
and
so
that makes it
right.
makes it very clear that you cannot, when you're dealing with China, you cannot separate political issues from economic issues. That China will link them together. Think of climate change cooperation with the United States, right? The United States has always been frustrated by China's actions on climate change, or China's willingness to cooperate on climate change, um, because China is always linking that cooperation with the United States to other political issues, such as the
Mm.
Taiwan issue, or the human rights issues, or the South China Sea issue.
So perhaps it's more of a weaponization of the linkage, right? I mean, I think all powers in one way or another do issue linkage, right? Like, you help
Right.
me on this issue, I'll help you on that issue. There's a kind of a strategic reciprocity, right? But I think what makes China quite special, quote unquote, is they really weaponize it, including using dialogue, mechanisms as a kind of a leverage point. Like, if you don't give me this, we're not going to talk, right? So what you're arguing is that there was this age of innocence, if I could put it, right, whereby I think a lot in the West, including Japan, right, who should have known better, had perhaps some degree of naivety about the direction of China. Obviously, of course, Xi Jinping was still not in the game, and many would argue that Xi Jinping changed the game. But this is not about China, this is about Japan. So if Xi Jinping was really quite a decisive, transformative figure in China, you could say that the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe also was very much a transformative figure. Obviously, the reason I also discussed the DPJ interlude is because Abe came before and after that interlude, right? He
Right.
was briefly the Prime Minister. Things didn't go very well initially, but he laid down the foundation of what he'll do later on, right? I mean, the whole Indo-Pacific, one could argue, the whole Indo-Pacific framework, doctrine, episteme, however you want to put it, you could say he's the undeclared architect of that, right? Can we briefly talk about Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and how transformative he has been in reshaping Japan's place in the world?
Right. I think he was very transformative in a way that he was able to push for security reforms and provide leadership. Security remains a very sensitive issue for the Japanese public, right? In Many isolationist voices here, for example, would argue that over the past 70 years, Japan has been peaceful. Japan has stayed away from conflicts elsewhere in the world. And so why change that, right? But Prime Minister Abe sort of argued
Mm-hmm.
that international security impacts Japanese security. And he was able to provide that leadership to push for reforms, the reinterpretation of the Constitution, for example, right? And I think that's one
Can we talk
peculiar.
about that? Like, what do you mean by the reinterpretation? Like, so there was no revision of the Constitution because you need a certain legislative level of support and then take it to the referendum. We still don't know.
Mhm.
I mean, the jury's still out on that if this is possible given the coalition politics in Japan. But just on that point, what did he do? I mean, the idea of like common security, shared security. I mean, which gave operational flexibility, right, for Japan. That we are pacifists, but we can also help our friends in a semi-lethal way if things really go down the haywire. I mean, could you explain to us what was the reinterpretation move, for that matter, maneuver under the prime ministerships
Mhm.
of Abe?
So I think we have to understand that the U.S.-Japan alliance is not mutual, in a sense that
Right.
the United States is obligated to defend Japan, but in return, Japan is only obligated to offer or to provide land for military bases, right? there was really no obligation for Japan legally to assist the United States in times of conflict. Now, that changed with the reinterpretation of Article 9, allowing Japan to exercise collective self-defense, meaning that if the United States is attacked, it has the legal authority to respond and assist, right? Not just limited to logistical support, but actually
Potentially
engage
lethal?
combat in defense of an ally. Uh, that's actually peculiar because with the U.S.-Philippine alliance, it's mutual. We have the obligation to assist the
Right.
United States in the Pacific area, right? And that's in the treaty. With Japan, it's not mutual. And so the reinterpretation of the Constitution
Interesting.
that allows Japan to exercise collective self-defense was an Abe legacy, right? But having said that, I think in the DPJ, in the opposition, it's still not mainstream. The thing that you talked about, Hatoyama
Yeah.
premiership, I think that was an outlier of sort
Right.
because even the DPJ is cognizant of the threat that China posed. Remember the 10 Coast Guard vessels that were promised to the Philippines under President Aquino, that was not promised by the LDP government, right? That was
Right.
promised under the
Right.
DPJ government. Prime Minister Noda, in his meeting with President Aquino in 2010, promised, or even 2009, if I'm not mistaken, promised to provide 10 Coast Guard vessels to the Philippines. That was delayed because of several issues related to our own bureaucracy in the Philippines, especially when I think there was a demand on the part of the Philippine government for some of these vessels to be built
Right.
or to be manufactured in the Philippines to provide jobs for our own people. Nevertheless, Japan delivered, right? And we got the vessels. And so I think that's also an Abe legacy because that came about during the Abe administration, right? The 10 vessels were all delivered
Right.
when Prime Minister Abe was the prime minister.
That's a very good point that, maybe Hatoyama, not only the DPJ rule was kind of an interlude, but Hatoyama himself was a sui generis within the DPJ. I mean, there's the Ozawa faction, you mentioned Noda, among others. So for those perhaps who are familiar with the internal politics of DPJ, they would say that, it's also not a major departure from what comes under Abe. Let's talk about Abe. So what was the game plan by Abe when he came in? And to what degree do you think he was able to achieve what he set out himself to do when he was back by 2012? Or December 2012, he gets elected. By 2030, he's in. First months or so, I think February 2013, he already sends everyone across ASEAN, right? So I think you could see ASEAN first diplomacy was very prominent under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Can we talk a little bit about that? Why is ASEAN so important to Japan, especially for Abe?
I think for the Japanese, Southeast Asia is their backyard, if you will. And Japan has always been proud about its ODA achievements in the region, right? It's always, I think some in JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, would argue that Japan's ODA performance in Southeast Asia is way better than the Europeans'
Right.
development assistance in Africa, right? So comparing Africa and Southeast Asia, they've always seen Southeast Asia as their backyard or their front yard, and so they care about economic security in Southeast Asia,
Or strategic depth, yeah. I think.
Pardon?
Or strategic depth. I think the backyard is a kind of like a pejorative terms nowadays. I don't want to put you in trouble. I think maybe you mean also strategic depth, right? Kind of like traditional area of influence and engagement, yeah.
Absolutely. So they see Southeast Asia as really important for them in terms of economic security as well. And I think the region has been helpful to Japan. Remember in the 1970s when there was an economic friction between the United States and Japan, when Japan was approaching the economic size of the United States, they saw Southeast Asia as an opportunity to offshore some of their or to reshore some of their manufacturing bases, right? And so Southeast Asia has playing an important role for Japan's economic security. In fact, played a role for Japan's economic takeoff in the 1970s. They've always been concerned about the sea lines of communications from the Strait of Malacca to the South China Sea. They have, in fact, my good friend Jay Tariela has argued that because of Japan's assistance, Coast Guard agencies or Coast Guard organizations in Southeast Asia have developed significantly. And that development of Coast Guard and maritime safety and
Right.
security capabilities have allowed the Japanese to maintain their sea lines of communication, their trading routes, right? And so I think they see Southeast Asia as really important. And whenever China would come in, they don't necessarily see that as a threat. But if Southeast Asians are threatened, they see China getting leverage through which to
Right.
coerce not just Southeast Asia, but the region. You remember, for example, in 2010, right? In
Right.
2010, there was the Senkaku trawler incident. What happened then? Economic coercion from China imposed against Japan, right? Several of the Japanese executives were held hostage in China while the crisis was ongoing. In addition, China imposed the rare earth mineral ban, and at that time, 97% of the supply of rare earth minerals in the world was controlled by China.
Right.
And so, given all of these, I think the Japanese are thinking we should be, or Japan should be helping Southeast Asians become more resilient in these aspects, so that for Japan's economic security as well, if Southeast Asians are beholden to one power in the region, for example, who happen to be authoritarian, that could have a long-term implication to Japan. Also, what happened in the South, what happens in the South China Sea is always being observed by the Japanese. They see
Right.
what's happening in the South China Sea as something that could happen in the East China Sea. In fact, some of the things that China has been doing in the South China Sea has already been employed in the East
Right.
China Sea.
I mean, it's like the first island chain. There's a connectivity with what happens there. Obviously, we'll also talk about Taiwan. Now, going back to this, so with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, obviously, I think he was very successful in making sure that the United States remains invested. And even under Trump, we saw that he essentially, he was the undeclared architect behind the whole Indo-Pacific strategy of the Trump administration, the free and open Indo-Pacific. A lot of that has a Shinzo Abe imprint. And it's important to talk about Shinzo Abe because the next two prime ministers were more or less his proteges, right? Suga very shortly, and then, of course, right now, you have Kishida. I mean, are there any discontinuities since Prime Minister Abe departed? Or do you see more or less this is the Abe legacy being continued by other quite able persons? Because in the case of Kishida, he was a foreign minister back in the day and someone who really knows the region very well.
Yeah, so I would argue that this is a continuation of the trajectory of Japanese foreign policy under Prime Minister Abe. But I think the biggest change is
Mm-hmm.
more on the symbolic side, because it's in Abe's dream to really revise the Constitution of Japan, in particular Article 9, right? But if you look at Article 9, other people may have misinterpreted Abe's intention. But if you look at Article 9, it has two parts, right? The first part says the state
Right.
announces war as an instrument of national policy. Abe did not want to change that.
Right.
Because in fact, even if you have that in your constitution, if you are a member of the United Nations, you have signed the UN Charter. The UN Charter says
Right.
that use of force is not allowed. And so even if that's not in your constitution, you're still not allowed to use force in essence, right?
So that's the
So I
norm.
would
That's the
not want to
international
change that.
norm. Yeah.
Right, that's part one. Second part, though, is something that Abe wants to revise, because the second part of Article 9 says that Japan would not be possessing a military force, which is, of course, a lie, right? Because the Japanese military, the self-defense force, is probably among the most lethal in the world. So Abe wants to sort of legalize
A
once
de
and for
facto
all
situation. Yeah.
the existence of the SDF. And so that's the dream that he obviously has not achieved, because of the very high bar for referendum, and also for supermajority in the Diet.
But has the Japanese public opinion, I mean, let's say, uh, just for the sake of argument, for some reason, internal coalition politics, because LDP is also with, the Komeito Party, etc. Let's just say for some magical reasons they get over that. The internal apprehensions, intra-coalition apprehensions. When it comes to the Japanese public opinion, do you think it's also tracking with the what we understand as the opinion of the strategic elite in Japan? Because I've been dealing with the Japanese strategic elite for quite some time. I see where they're going, and I think there's a lot of overlap with the Philippines. But in terms of public opinion in Japan, do you think it's also moving in that direction? I mean, are surveys reflecting that? I mean, I can look at the Asahi Shimbun survey, it says something. I can look at some less more conservative newspaper, they'll say something perhaps not exactly the same. I mean, what is your reading of the sociology behind the public support of a shift in Japanese foreign policy?
So I have to, first of all, be honest with you that I have not looked at the recent polling. However, my observation is that unlike in the Philippines, so many Japanese people are not really opinionated on issues. Even if you look at their election turnout, for example, it's very low, right? You walk in Shibuya and then randomly ask a Japanese person about his opinion on Article 9. He probably give you a I don't know that, or I don't care about that, right?
Yeah.
So unlike in and also I think that's another another peculiar thing here in Japan. If you have not learned about something, or if you've not studied about something, you're hesitant to say something about it, right? Unlike in our
it's the opposite, right? The less you know, the more you want to say something.
Right. So in Japan, I think, although I would argue there's also a slight disconnect. I think the younger people are more hesitant for Japan to be more assertive in the areas of security.
Interesting.
But again, I have not seen the latest polling on that.
Yes.
But my gut feeling says, based on my interaction with my students, for example, that they are content with the status quo. In other words, they like the way Japan is dealing with security issues now. They don't want Article 9 to be revised, for example. They want to continue to rely on the United States. And if U.S. commitment is weak, there is almost nobody in the mainstream who would argue get rid of the alliance. There is still that overwhelming trust on the United States.
Yeah, I'm sorry for pushing you on that. I mean, none of us here are like sociologists, etc. But I just wanted to understand, because public opinion eventually will be important should this go down to referendum, right? You have to have majority vote. And my understanding is there's no point in pushing the coalition or legislative vote in certain direction if there's no really much shift in terms of public opinion. And all the numbers I've been seeing over the past decade or so, there is a kind of a trajectory, but I don't think it's as definitive that like huge shift in terms of public opinion, because I'm comparing it, for instance, with the Pew Survey in the US. If you look at the Pew Survey in the US 10, 15 years ago, you'll always find a Middle Eastern country there in the list of top 3. The latest one I saw in June, not even a single Middle Eastern country. There was North Korea and then Russia, but China by far. So China completely changes its position in terms of threat perception of Americans when you look at the Pew Survey. With Japan, I don't know. When it comes to, of course, I'm talking about specifically the pacifist constitution support for referendum. But going back to this,
but Richard, that's I think that's also immaterial, sort of, among the Japanese public, because again, as I've said, Article 9 has 2 parts. The first part is something that the Japanese people and even Prime Minister Abe himself did not really want to revise. The second part, whether you revise it or not, Japan has a lethal armed forces, right? Has a military organization. So I think it's that's another important distinction, perhaps, between the Philippines and Japan, is the less legalistic approach of Japan, right? In the Philippines, whenever there are issues like this, they would say, let's go to the Supreme Court and let the Supreme Court decide. I think in Japan, the Supreme Court here is not deciding on things that are political in nature. Right. And so, for example, the reinterpretation of the Constitution, right? That was reinterpreted by the Abe cabinet. So now they can exercise collective self-defense without revising the constitution. The old interpretation was Article 9 prohibited Japan from exercising collective self-defense. In other words, if the United States is attacked in Japanese waters or in Japanese exclusive economic zone, Japan has no legal authority to intervene or
Right.
to defend the United States.
I also wanted to talk about this because you hear a lot of propaganda from certain quarter, of course, of Japanese militarism, and they talk about it as if Japan wants to be an openly aggressive militaristic country like the World War II situation. They talk about a militaristic faction within Japan. So that's why I'm trying to contextualize this, because we have to push back against some of this very erroneous and factually incorrect characterization of what Japan is doing. So what you're arguing is that, first of all, it's a revision of a certain portion of it, but the revision is more like the formalization of a geopolitical reality, which is Japan having one of the best, most sophisticated armed forces anywhere in the world, even though it's called defense forces. Now, let's talk about this. With the Kishida administration, of course, last year there was this big speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue when Prime Minister Kishida talked about this, he recognized that Japan for a long time has been more of a source of economic contribution to international security, but now they're going to step up to the game. And I think he even mentioned that Japan is still the third largest economy, so the implication is its military defensive capabilities has to be commensurate. Now, having said that, so Japan, you expect, should have a defense spending that is closer to Russia's, right? Or way bigger than Russia, because Russia is barely top 10 economies in the world. Now, how is that going down in Japan? Because I think as a share of GDP, it's going to be from 1% to 2% over the next 5 years, or 4 years for that matter. This is nothing crazy. Like 2% of GDP is still way lower than US and also China, even officially speaking, and way lower than Russia. Is that going down well in Japan? I mean, I don't see LDP losing big time in elections, right? If anything, they have steadily dominated Japanese politics. So is that an idea? Does that show that Japan has, there's a popular support or at least acquiescence to this? Again, I'm saying this because a certain country which is not democratic, sometimes tries to mention the democracy of Japan to question their foreign policy. But if the people of Japan are angry about it, but I don't see that reflected in the elections, right? Even as you say, of course, foreign policy is not always a number one issue. Now, again, this is about contextualization. You're joining me from Tokyo, so we want to hear what's going on there on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is willingness. All right. If you're talking about willingness to respond to China's assertiveness in the region and in the IR community, the IR
strategic elite,
balancing, right? Japan is balancing the rise of China, the assertiveness of China, the threat that China poses. Now, there is willingness. However, structurally, there are impediments to Japan's willingness to spend more, for example. And even though, so you've mentioned about some people arguing that Japan's returning to its old militaristic past, even though, for the sake of argument, that's not true, of course, but for the sake of argument, assuming that's true, Japan would still not be able to achieve that. Why? How many people here are 65 years old and over, right? There's a majority of the Japanese population is 65 years old and over. So are they expecting the old people to fight?
Yeah.
To
so the
join
demographic
the
is not there, yeah.
Right. So demography is not the in terms of their demographic, that's a big structural impediment. But at the same time, the GDP, Japan's economy still remains stagnant. If you look at economic indicators, the GDP of Japan in 1990 was $5 trillion, and I think it's still $5 trillion today. And so there is barely any growth.
Right.
And Japan has reached its peak. I don't think there is any more growth in this country. The population is shrinking also by 200,000 people a year. By 2050, it could be that Japan would be 70 million people in terms of its population. So there is really no structural support to the idea that Japan would become a military force once again. Even, you have talked about the OSA, the Overseas Security Assistance. Even that is not really significant in terms of dollar value. It's no
like
longer
13 or 14 million dollars. I mean, like something like that. I heard,
can't even buy fighter jet from the United States, right?
I don't think
So
you can even buy
that's
a Lamborghini or something like that. I mean, it's like, yeah,
so it's not
yeah,
significant. However, it's helpful for us because we need.
right,
I don't think there is a desire for the Philippines to match China, right? I think what we want is just to be able to withstand the sustained coercion from the Chinese, and these are all falling within the gray zone, meaning that these are not outright armed aggression against the Philippines. These are coercion that, if managed properly by the Philippines, we could withstand
right.
these coercive maneuvers. Um, but again, in the 1990s, you combine the economy, the GDP of the entire Asia. Japan's
Japan
GDP
was
was
still,
the
yeah,
biggest,
both trade,
right?
also in investment. I mean,
Yeah,
I've used some of the graphs in my own works. I mean, it's
right,
incredible how things have changed in just, half a generation. We're not even talking about a century or half. So this
right.
has been a dramatic shift that perhaps, I mean, I always say if there's a Thucydides trap here, it's more of Japan, China, because the shift in balance has been far more radical than the United States, which is still the biggest economy, and some even expect it to remain the biggest economy by the end of the century, given that China is also facing demographic winter of its own. Now,
That-
going back to this, do you think that Japan, the reason I'm asking this is because if you look at the surveys by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, the most authoritative survey of opinion makers, policy makers in the region in terms of international affairs, Japan tends to be always number one or two, along with EU.
Mhm.
So it looks like some of us in Southeast Asia, or a significant number of us in Southeast Asia, yes, Japan is a U.S. ally. At some point, it was the Robin to the Batman. But again, sorry for using this kind of metaphors. But is Japan looking at itself and saying, maybe I could be the Flash to the Superman Batman dynamic between U.S. and China? Sorry for using it, but I'm just trying to visualize this for people to understand that Japan is big enough still, that's third largest economy, and with one of the biggest navy, more sophisticated, to be kind of a force on its own, right? Not in opposition to the U.S., but kind of a parallel course, right? Which
Right.
is what Macron in Europe has been talking about, right? Like Macron in Europe, is saying that yes, we are part of NATO, but Europe can play its own independent role on the global stage. And my understanding is, can Japan do that also, despite all the structural limitations that you very correctly mentioned a while ago?
Uh, I think so. Let's talk about the first part of the thing that you said. I think it has a lot to do with Japan's ODA system, right? So if you even though China has
Interesting.
engaged with Southeast Asia with its own version, the Belt and Road Initiative, the ODA experience that Southeast Asians have with Japan really made an impression, right? That Japan is not there to strangle these countries through debts, right? So if you look at the ODA scheme of Japan, for example, it's low interest rate, 0.1% interest rate, almost free money. Also, 25% grant component, right?
Right,
Meaning 25% you don't have to return. So these things really, if you look at it, it's really for development, right? And
right,
if there are maybe impediments to the speed through which these projects are being undertaken, it's because Japan has a robust checks and balances, right? So they want to make sure, for example, that the ODA they provide are indeed going to development projects and not being subjected to, I don't know, whims of the politicians and things like that. So safeguards against corruption, for example.
right,
But with BRI, with Southeast Asians' experience with BRI is, Chinese laborers coming in to implement the BRI projects, delays in construction. Right now, I think several weeks ago, there was the launching of the first bullet train in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. That was built by China.
the
But I
Bandung
think in
Jakarta one, yeah,
right, if in hindsight, Japan lost the bid, slightly more expensive. But in the end, if you look at the final price tag of that, it's twice more expensive than the Japanese offer, right? So the cost ballooned, the Chinese labor came in, and so on and so forth. So I think with Japan, there is consistency in their ODA approach, right? And real ODA, because there's 25% component. There is
yeah,
no 25% grant component for BRI projects, right? It's really
right, for
loans,
the
and
Chinese one.
the interest rate is 3% and up. So uh, And in addition, there are instances whereby China would insert onerous provisions in the contract. For example, the railway project in Thailand that was canceled eventually because the Chinese insisted on a provision that if Thailand fails to pay or failed to pay, that the train would be taken over by China. The train line would be taken over by China. So obviously the Thais were not happy with that and they pulled out from that. So I think there is this experience with China, very different from our experience with Japan, and that makes Japan,
Right.
really favorable to us in these respects. But on half of your question about Japan, maybe asserting itself as its, a
Security
power
player, yeah.
itself, security partner in itself. Um, I would argue again the demographics and the structural impediments are there, and probably that will be a little uh, difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, the opportunity I think that Japan recognizes is that there is a division of labor of sort with the United States, meaning that Japan could continue to play a role in countering China's development program that really is buying influence in the region, while the United States can concentrate on security. So, and that's for a
So it's a
long time there's a
complementary role.
parallel effort,
Yeah.
right? There's that parallel effort in the case of the Philippines, for example, the Coast Guard. So the Philippine Coast Guard now, by the way, is the largest Coast Guard organization in Southeast Asia, thanks to the Japanese, right?
Right.
In terms of the number of surface assets. And those surface assets do not have guns, right? Do not have lethal weapons. Those are just platforms, in other words, because those are things that Japan could provide. Uh, but the United States could then focus its limited resources on beefing up maybe our military, right? Because there are no sensitivities about surrounding U.S. providing lethal weapons to the Philippines. But there was that before this OSA, some sensitivity on Japan providing lethal weapons to third countries.
This has been a long conversation. Thank you very much. I just wanted our audience to have a proper understanding of the domestic and international drivers of Japan's foreign policy. So thank you for saying that actually Japan in many ways is perhaps an underappreciated player in infrastructure development, because if you look at the numbers, and I've been saying this forever, China is more of a pledge trap, right? A lot of pledges, but not much coming in. Japan is not as loud and self-promotional, but actually they've been doing a lot, and they lead China in Vietnam, in Philippines, and it's quite competitive in Indonesia and Malaysia, even when you just look at the pledges, right? Huge game by Japan. But in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea situation, there are now discussions about the reciprocal access agreement. I mean, is this a VFA in all but name? And isn't that going to be controversial also back in Japan if they're going to have a VFA style kind of relationship? Because my sense is in the Philippines, there's a lot of excitement around this. I think Senator Mig Zubiri of heading the Senate said, "Oh, don't worry. If this comes down to ratification, we got the numbers." And actually, I kind of believe him, because I think there's just so much fear about what's happening with China. Just like what happened with the Status of Forces Agreement with Australia, they slept on it for a few years and then they immediately signed it once the Scarborough crisis happened. So I do think that perhaps the numbers are there for a VFA style agreement. But just from the view from Japan, what's going on here?
I think that's not a controversy for Japan. So, and also that's not the first VFA of Japan. Japan has a VFA, a status of visiting force agreement with the United States, with the UK,
Right.
with Australia. And so this is not really unprecedented for the
With the
Japanese.
UK without having a treaty alliance. Because
Right.
with the US, they have a treaty alliance, right? But
Right. Also with Australia.
also with us.
So,
Right.
yeah,
So you're
they're all
saying more like
US
Australia,
allies.
UK style. Yeah.
Right. And so I don't think that's going to be controversial here in Japan.
Interesting.
In fact, whenever there are news of Chinese coercion in the South China Sea, I think mainstream Japanese politicians feel sympathetic to our cause, to the Philippines, because they have been experiencing that maybe to a lesser degree in the East China Sea. But they see us, and so they want to help. There is no, I don't think there is a controversy surrounding that. But also at the same time, I remember when there were Balikatan exercise in the past, and the Japanese self-defense force came in to observe. But there were protests in Manila saying that we don't have VFA with Japan, how come Japanese troops are here? So I think
Right.
it's time for that VFA, and that VFA is going to be welcome. After all, there is really trust between the two governments now.
Yes.
So
And the VFA creates the legal guardrails, right? Like just in case something goes wrong. I mean, that's so in a way, it's kind of like a revision of Article 9. You're like formalizing and creating guardrails around geopolitical reality. No. Last point. Do you think that it's possible down the road? I mean, tensions are getting quite scary in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. I mean, we can argue about it, about who's causing it. Obviously, of course, the position of many really experts, independent experts, is that it's not Philippines' fault that things are going wrong. But do you think at some point Japan will be open to give even more sophisticated military hardware to the Philippines? I mean, now we're talking about radars, maritime domain awareness. You correctly talk about the Philippine Coast Guard as the biggest beneficiary here. But are you looking at something more substantial, like next generation fighter jets, as Japan also tries to develop sixth generation fighter with UK and Italy? Are we looking at artilleries or those kinds of weaponry? Is that something that can be realistically expected if the current trajectory intensifies, especially with also the Taiwan issue there, right? Because the Philippines is also becoming important to Taiwan because of the EDCA basing access in northern Philippines. So if you're Japan, Philippines is very, very important to you, right? For Taiwan, for South China Sea, for East China Sea, and of course, we're all U.S. allies in one way or another.
yes, I think at some point, Japan is starting from the very bottom. They try, now it's a radar system, but in the future it could involve the purchase of more sophisticated weapons. Of course, obviously, it's gonna be a matter of cost. Can we
And sorry,
afford?
can you connect this? I think this is important. What I call JAFUS, right? The Japan, Philippine, U.S. Trilateral Alliance. I mean, do you think that there could be a situation where U.S. and Japan kind of coordinate to help to build up the Philippines or
Yeah,
boost the Philippines' modernization, military modernization?
absolutely. I think there is that opportunity for the United States and Japan to beef up the Philippines, not necessarily to win against China, but to make sure that we are helpful in any form of contingency. And as you have mentioned, the Philippines and Japan have a shared national security interest when it comes to Taiwan, right? Up north, you have Japan. Down
Right.
south, there's the Philippines. And there are US bases in Okinawa and US presence in EDCA bases in northern Luzon. And so those bases are going to be critical should there be contingency. And as you know, if we want the United States to help us in the South China Sea, I
Right.
think I think we should be, or the Philippines should be playing a role in ensuring regional security. And the Japanese and the Americans are of course cognizant of the Philippine role, and so there is that appetite, there is that willingness to help the Philippines.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Jeff Ordaniel, for giving us that really comprehensive view about Japan, Philippines, and in fact, the bigger triangle, right? The Philippine, Japan, US aspect, and not to mention also the China, Philippine, Japan aspect. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us and for that very comprehensive view.
Thank you, sir.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Haydarian, and that was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.